Musical chairs. So. And we got the full board here. There we go. Oh. What? All right, it's 7 p.m. So we want to be respectful of your time. So excited to see such a strong turnout, and thank you to anyone who's watching at home or maybe watching this later tonight. This is a really important topic, so we're really glad to have everyone here. In order for us to build a stronger future for Roselle and develop a funding plan that strikes that balance between creating new revenue sources and borrowing funds, we're reaching out to the community to educate our residents on how infrastructure funding works, but also to get your feedback so we can, as a board, have a great path forward for our community. Tonight, we're so grateful to have all of you here tonight, and we're going to have a lot of opportunities to go through questions and to interact throughout the night. So hopefully this will be informative, but also a way for us to engage and get your feedback throughout the night. Before we get started, I just want to make a couple of introductions. So I'm Mayor David Pileski. I'm really proud and happy to have our Board of Trustees with us. So if they stand and raise their hand briefly, I have Trustee Tom Pierkowski here tonight, Trustee Lee Trejo, Trustee Tom Della Penna, Trustee Wayne Domke, Trustee Bruce Berkshire, and Trustee Cheryl Lanisa with us tonight. So got a number of different staff and other officials with us here tonight, and you'll be hearing from them. But I've got up here, and you'll be hearing from later tonight, Public Works Director Karen Young, Village Administrator Jason Belowski, and Finance Director Tom Dahl. As we go through the updates, we're going to explain how infrastructure is currently funded in our community and talk about the tools that we can use to secure the funding that we need. After each section, we're going to have an opportunity to go through any questions that you may have, and we're going to try to keep them as relevant to the direct topic as we can, since we will have breaks throughout the evening to go over what's going on. And then at the end of the night, we have a brief survey. So all of you who have a packet with you, that last page, we just ask that you fill that out at the end so we can get your feedback. We'll also be doing that digitally. So if you need to think about it, digest the information, you want to fill it out later, you're absolutely able to do that as well. So to get us started tonight, oh, and there's the agenda. So now you've got an idea what we're going to be looking at. So when we talk infrastructure, what does that actually mean? So we're talking about streets and sidewalks. We're talking about our water system. How do we get water to your house, but also how do we take the wastewater from your house to our treatment plants and later go on to collect that and treat it? We're talking about stormwater. So when it rains, we have gutters and other systems that collect that water so it can go somewhere else instead of flooding your basement, as well as buildings and grounds. So like Village Hall here today, these are all things that we consider infrastructure that we have to maintain each and every day. So in Roselle, we have several miles worth of infrastructure to maintain, both above the ground and below the ground, which can make it seem misleading how much we actually have to maintain. Now, we maintain our infrastructure through a number of annual programs. So certain infrastructure programs are determined by a multi-year kind of capital improvement plans. And so we decide on a 5-year horizon, for instance, and we decide these are the issues that we have, whether it's in a state of decline that needs to be addressed, or there's a serious concern that we have as far as the reliability of it, and we need to address those. We also forecast out further out, but for the purposes of funding and whatnot, forecasts get less reliable as you go out. Think about the weather, 10 days out, who knows what it's going to be, but we have a better idea 2 days out. Similar idea. We try to focus on those early years so we can make sure our projects and our funding both are able to match up. Priority is often determined based on the age and the reliability of that infrastructure. Just because a street was paved 10 years ago and another street was paved, 20 years ago, they could be in different states of decline. And so we want to make sure we're not just looking at one criteria like age, but also looking at the conditions that exist today to make sure we're making the right projects. The other thing that we try to do, and I think this is a great thing that Roselle has been able to do to stretch your dollars further, is we don't just do one project and then the next year come back and have to do another project in that same area. We try to group together things so we can have reduced costs. So if we're going to do a water main replacement, let's also pave that street at the same time because we have the contractors there. We already have to repair the street. There's nothing worse than just completing a project and a couple years later having to redo it all over again. So we already do those things today as a village. That's something we should all be very proud of. But with that being the case, we have continued needs to cover in the future that are going to be more difficult for us to maintain today based on what we've been budgeting. And so you can see here on the right-hand side, these are actual budget figures that we have included in the 2023 budget for this year and is money that we have to spend on these types of projects. The other thing that's coming up, and I'm sure we all feel it, I know I feel it at home when I go out and get a quote or a bid, costs are up. Labor's costs are up, material costs are up. Inflation is a real thing. And so a lot of those things also impact us as well, not just the quality and the state of our infrastructure. So how did we get here and why are we having this conversation today? There's a couple different main trends that are going here. And the first one is something that I think makes a lot of sense, but a lot of us probably haven't thought about it like this. Our last big population boom was in the 1980s. And so that was a great thing. Roselle had a lot of new homes being built. Many of you maybe live in those communities today. But a lot of that infrastructure is coming to the end of its useful lifespan. And when we see large developments go into communities like we had in the 80s, a lot of that wasn't done by the village. That was done by the developer and it was transferred ownership to the village at that time. So that was cost the village never had to spend in some cases. And now we're finally having that kind of moment where we actually have to invest our money into maintaining that or continuing to keep that quality that we have come to expect. The other thing is we've been conservatively budgeting, and I think that's a good thing, but there's also a trade-off to that. So the village has continued to live within its means and make good decisions. Are always evaluating our staffing models, looking to make sure where we're spending our money makes sense. That also means when push comes to shove, we defer maintenance. We sometimes reduce what we're going to spend on projects so that way we can keep our budget balance and not have to increase cost to residents. However, that does have a detrimental impact on our infrastructure. $1 million today is going a lot less further than $1 million did 10 years ago. And that's about what we've been spending on streets consistently. We have some great graphics on that coming up. The other thing is those two things aside, those are existing conditions. There's always something that has to kind of surprise you or throw a wrench in things that you have no control over. And I think this is a message that hopefully resonates a lot with people today, given the news and the merger. But the Illinois EPA has new mandates that are required for us to be in compliance with. On their face value, these are great regulations. We'll talk more about them. That's for keeping our water clean and safe, but there's a serious cost associated with those. A cost that has no funding for villages like Roselle to help us absorb that. So we're being asked by the state government and from the federal government to make investments into our infrastructure with no source of funding or guaranteed grants to help us through that. And then lastly, like we've kind of covered earlier, is just inflation. Costs have gone up. They're not going down anytime soon. And I think in general, it's something that we need to be more aggressive with in conjunction with these other 3 things going on. We could probably figure out a way to manage 1 or 2 of these, but the combination of all 4 of these things happening at the same time is getting us to a point where we need to have, a conversation like we're having tonight about what can we do differently as a community. So tied to that, the board recognized this struggle and this challenge, but knew that we had the right staff and the right ability to tackle this. And so our strategic plan that we adopted last year tackles a lot of these things in different areas. So we've wanted to make sure that we had strong financial stewardship, and we want to have revenue that meets the growing demand. We don't want to just cut our way out of a problem. We want to make sure that we're being aggressive about finding new sources of revenue. We also want to pursue grant opportunities for construction. And this is something that we've been really grateful to start to see ourselves be more agile in that. But the fact of the matter is, Roselle as a community, when we ask for grant money, we're seen as a not minority community and not an impoverished community. So a lot of criteria for grants, Roselle is not eligible for. Focused redevelopment. We're always going to try to find ways to grow our revenue by growing the village. There's an advantage to that helps us make that easier on residents. But we are a built-up community. There's limited redevelopment opportunities. And while we have some really exciting projects on the horizon that I can't wait to share with the community soon, these are only going to help us continue to keep up with pace, not necessarily grow what we need to do in terms of tackling this issue more seriously. Reliable infrastructure, which is at the core of what we're here to discuss today, is another strategic priority, and we're going to talk a lot more about that up next. So I'm gonna skip that one. But operational sustainability is also an important one for the board. We want to make sure we can meet the service demands and the capacity that we have today. The last thing we want to do is make your experience less desirable today. And then finally, customer experience. We know that there's going to be a solution here that's going to ask the village to step up and maybe contribute more. And with that, there's a responsibility to that. So we want to make sure we're driving a really good customer experience. We're engaging the community, getting their feedback, but also finding a plan that fits our community. We're not just going about this with a one size fits all, or let's just do the easy solution. We have options. And I think the beautiful thing here is we're not in an emergency situation today. We've got time to discuss, debate, and have a conversation as a community so we all feel comfortable with the decision that we can collectively make instead of it just being a board passed down decision. With that being the case, I'm going to turn it over to Karen to talk about infrastructure improvements.
Thank you. Good evening. So while the primary focus tonight is on our wastewater and water infrastructure, we wanted to take a minute to talk about our streets and sidewalk improvements. Each year, we do capital improvement projects in addition to our maintenance programs. And in 23 and 24, we have several programs planned. The first one is our Rodenberg Road resurfacing and reconstruction improvement project. That project's anticipated to start at the end of 2023 and will take place all the way through 24. It includes resurfacing and reconstruction of Rodenberg all the way from Irving Park Road to Central. The second project is our resurfacing of the Plum Grove Road bridge deck that will take place in 2024. And then we have several future improvements that we're looking to analyze and do design on. That includes both the Roselle Road and Irving Park Road, both streetscape and pedestrian improvements. That phase of the project will analyze concepts for that project as well as project costs to be evaluated by the board for future consideration. So as the mayor mentioned, we have annual infrastructure maintenance improvement programs in addition to our capital projects. These are what I would say your daily maintenance, like you would do on your home. We do daily maintenance and annual maintenance on our roadways to keep them in good shape. To best support our infrastructure, we need to ensure that those annual maintenance programs are sufficiently funded. One of the best examples our community needs to increase infrastructure support can be seen in this chart. It reflects essentially the condition of the road versus our annual funding. So on the left-hand side of that chart, you'll see numbers that rank like a condition of a road. Industry standards for good conditions of road are between 60 and 70 for the pavement condition, but the best practice is usually a little bit higher than 70. So the colored lines represent our annual funding. So the red line represents our current funding level of $1 million that we've been doing for several years. If we continue to fund this program at the same level, you see that a sharp decrease in the pavement conditions starting in 2024. If we increase our funding to 1.75 million, which is the top orange line, while we are increasing that funding, you still see that we have a decrease in those payment conditions starting in 2024. The green line, if we increase our funding to $2 million, does represent holding steady at their current levels. And then if we increased somewhere between 2.25 and $2.5 million, we would see year-over-year improvement in our roadway condition. So these are the kinds of considerations that we not only need to take in consideration for our roadway infrastructure, but also our water and sewer infrastructure. It's just not about funding these big ticket item projects, but it's about supporting our annual programs so that we can proactively take care of our community's infrastructure. So there are two common themes driving improvements to our water and wastewater infrastructure systems. The first one is the Illinois Environmental Protection Agency mandates. These are unfunded mandates that the village is required to do that doesn't have additional funding sources to them. So for our wastewater treatment plant, what that means, we need to do updates and expansion to both wastewater treatment plants. We do have two within the community to meet the nutrient removal limits for wastewater. On the water side of things, we would need to complete lead service line replacements within our water system. In addition to the regulation updates, we also have aging infrastructure. So critical updates to the facilities for both equipment due to their age and condition are required. And parts of our water system actually date back to the 1920s. So this chart shows the current estimate for project costs for both water and wastewater. The dark blue line represents our existing revenue, while the light blue anticipates our project costs in the next several years. And the green is the additional revenue we'll need per year to offset loans associated with water and wastewater projects. So the EPA lead service line mandates require that the village begin to replace lead service lines by 2027. The village has a small number of lead service lines compared to many other communities. Out of our approximately 8,400 service lines in the community, we have approximately 240 known or suspected lead services. In 2023, the village will be completing a water main replacement project on Maple Avenue, which will include the first lead service lines to be replaced in the community. As part of this, the street will also be resurfaced. And how we determine our annual programs is we base it off the overall age of that infrastructure, as well as the number of water main breaks in that location. And as previously mentioned, unfunded mandates means that we have new regulations that are brought down by state and federal government, but there's no additional funding provided to meet these regulations. So as I noted, Roselle has two wastewater treatment plants. The Devlin and Boderman wastewater treatment plants are the names of them. Built in 1928, the Devlin plant is the oldest of the two villages plants. The Boderman wastewater plant is younger than Devlin, but is still over 30 years old. Both plants need equipment updates. The village monitors the age, life cycle, and condition of the plants and equipment. While 30 years may not seem very long or very old, these facilities are always moving. They're always in motion throughout the day and night to keep up with the community's need, and the wear and tear is expected on this equipment. Regular maintenance is important to maintaining the service levels for our community. Each year we're invested in our wastewater treatment plants to keep them operational. Between 2013 and 2021, we invested $32 million in capital improvement projects to maintain these plants. That averages to about $3.6 million per year just at those two facilities. In 2023, facilities and equipment updates are estimated to cost just over $500,000. And the funding needed for these facilities and equipment updates are happening this year, as well as construction costs for upgrading facilities to meet these EPA mandates come from the same budget line. So we have some revenue in place already to fund these projects, but as we've explained, we've reached the point where we need to increase to fund these future projects effectively. So in addition to the necessary facility and equipment updates that are planned for this year, we are also working on the design and permitting for these future projects to meet these unfunded mandates for both nitrogen and phosphorus levels, at both wastewater treatment plants. At the Devlin plant, expansion is included with these mandated updates, and since the plant is reaching its capacity per the EPA. So to summarize what we've talked about so far, infrastructure impacts all residents and business owners within the community. The current strategic priorities focus on reliable infrastructure, and we all have a stake in that infrastructure. It impacts not only us today, but our future generations. Roseau's infrastructure needs more financial support due to unfunded mandates from the EPA or other regulatory agencies, our aging facilities, and the need to better support our annual infrastructure improvement programs for the long-term health and sustainability of our community. Necessary updates to our water and wastewater systems are a key priority. We have those unfunded mandates, as we talked about, and high project costs. Reliable wastewater and water systems are critical for the public health and safety and quality of life of those in Roselle. And finally, there are long lead times, not only from a permitting standpoint, but also an equipment standpoint. We are trying to take a proactive approach to make sure that we meet these regulations on time. So with that, we'd like to answer any questions as it relates to the current items we've talked about before we go into the financial aspects.
When are these IEPA mandates? When is the deadline that they need to be completed by?
So water begins in 2027. We have to complete 7% per year. I believe it's up till 2042. And wastewater, we are beginning improvements in 25, and we have to have improvements completed by 27, 28, and 29.
Hi, my name is Dale King. I've been here before. And it's real nice that you speak about all of these infrastructures reaching their due date to be done. Well, we live in the community over, I call it the Lincoln subdivision. We were built in 56. We still have that stuff there. Now, we had a problem on our street where the street collapsed, which is, you know, it's terrible. We've got a school at the end of our block. School buses come down those streets. And the thing about it is I had thought about this afterwards. What really made that hole was the garbage truck, because it was garbage day. And he had stopped there, picked up I'm sure he didn't notice it. You know, it probably crumbled after he left. But it's in the middle of the street. Okay. Now, the village came out there the next day or whatever it was that day. They brought their vac out and they vacuumed water out of there. They must have done it 3 or 4 times. Okay. Which shows me that it's groundwater. It's not the sewer water that they were vacuuming out of there. There's no way they could use it 3 or 4 times to suck all that water out. Well, what I did notice the next day or so, my sump pump in my house wasn't going off. It was not going off. It was, you know, it would just be quiet. And it's like, I kept running down there to make sure it was working. Well, it was working. And it's just all groundwater there. Our backyards, if it rains really hard, I can declare it a swimming pool back there. Now, I understand it's on the same way on the next block when we had that power outage, when the trees came down and stuff. I talked to the ComEd. He goes, it's a swamp back there. He says, it's hard to get back there. There you go. It's all due to the groundwater. We have no sewer. We have no storm sewers on our block. The water sits in our ditches. Where's it going to go? It's going to go down. What's it going to do? It's going to collect underneath there. What's it going to do? It's just going to erode underneath the roads. It happens everywhere. Now, you look at the block south of us, Granville, that was done a couple of years ago, or whatever. New curbs, everything's all fancy and nice. They had new sewers and stuff. just another year or so later, they graded it all over and then repaved it over again. Why? I haven't a clue why they would do that. We sit there on our street, which is just the next block up. We get nothing. I told the mayor what I call my street. I love my neighbors. I love my street. But you know what? It's Tobacco Road. We just get passed over constantly. We've lived with that street that way forever. And I don't understand why you can go over to the south of Central and redo streets 2 and 3 times. Okay, ours, we get that little patch over, which was done, I don't know how many years ago, but you couldn't tell. You couldn't tell if you come on our street now. You really couldn't. It's a disaster. You know, you go up and you talk about cars, traffic wise. Well, when those trains come by, traffic backs up past past our street. You know what those people do? They turn on our street to go around. They take it up to Lincoln and take Lincoln over to Irving. So our street is well used. It is well used. I mean, 99% of the people on our block work. 2 people per household that drive cars, 2 house, I happen to be retired. So I see all of this, and just nothing gets done. Like I said, I love my street. I love Roselle. Lived here for over 30 years. My son went to school through Roselle. And it's just a wonderful place. But when we've been stepped on and pushed around for 30 some years, it just gets to be a little bit ridiculous. I just don't understand why we get passed over constantly. You got Devon on one side, beautiful street, curbs, everything's fancy, all new storm sewers. They do have storm sewers at the end of what's the name? Marion and Rosemont. Okay, where does it go? It just goes right there. It doesn't go out. There's no storm sewer going anywhere. They just got it collecting underneath the roads and stuff. It's all fancy and nice, but where does it go? It doesn't go anywhere. Our ditches don't do anything. They just collect the water. Just collect that water. And where does it go?
I didn't want to interrupt you. So in that area of town specifically, we are doing several stormwater studies specifically related to stormwater. So we call that our Meacham Creek Basin. That whole area of town west of Roselle Road down through the east through Turner Pond is all part of one large study. We have 3 large studies going on throughout the community that we've identified as stormwater issues. So that's one of the areas that we're just having the initial study completed. So that's part of it. The second part of it is we do a 5-year pavement study. We have a agency that comes in town. They drive every single block of every single street that helps us identify that. So we're taking all that information. We're at the next stage where we're going to be reevaluating the next 5 years. So we have this, we're finishing up our current 5-year program. We're moving on to the next 5-year program. So all of that will be taken into account and determined the next set of improvements, which may impact your area.
Well, who?
To Karen's point, and I totally understand the frustration. Going back to one of those earlier slides, we've got over 80 miles of streets that we're responsible for. And I think the problem is when we do flat budgeting like we have done, there's probably always a worse street. And I think the whole goal is here is that that's not an okay mentality.
For 30 years though?
I understand your frustration, and that's why we're here today, is to try to help fix this problem and make sure that we can have a more mindful approach to this, because what we've done is we budget by dollar amount, not by we're going to do X number of feet or miles of street every year. And so as the years go by, I understand your point. We have resurfaced the street. We haven't done a complete reconstruction, but the whole point here is we've been trying to keep our figures in line with what we've been setting instead of trying to figure out the bigger picture here. And I think that's what we're trying to solve here tonight. I love the comments and the enthusiasm about it, but I think that's what we're trying to solve here tonight. And so we do these studies and we prioritize them based on those results. And that's why we're trying to make sure, because we know that there are some shortcomings when we don't have enough funds to actually address all the problems.
I understand about the funds. I worked for the government, and there's always another pocket to pull it from. Move a project, taking into consideration, that street is much better condition than ours. Okay. And personally, I don't know about the rest of my neighbors, I don't want to see a $12,000 bill for repairs. Because you know what? I hope everybody in here will buy a pencil from me because I'm going to stand out there and sell them.
Yes, I'm also on Rosemount Avenue. Just to piggyback of what he said, we've had 6 houses within the past 2 years where the sewer system is broken in the middle of the street, not on the homeowner's property, and yet they were billed. The numbers varied in terms of the fees, and they have to come up with this money within a certain time frame, or from what I understood, they'll be penalized. So you had one homeowner that paid like 12,000, another that paid 8 for the same work, and now we're dealing with the street was built in what, 56, so we're close to 70 years old, and it's still the same clay pipes, and it's just difficult to understand that. Why are we held liable for the infrastructure that is in the middle of the street and that is not on our legal property? Why do we have to pay that bill? Because if that were to happen to me, I would have to either sell my house, refinance it, or lose it. I got a couple options, but this, for something to happen tomorrow, it could happen tomorrow, because we already had it happen 6 times on our neighbor's block, and not including the fact that the water supply on my street alone, yeah, twice in the same spot, but it happened about 6 times within the past 4 years, the water main, but yet that was covered. And that was between the sidewalk and the street, that was covered, but something that's in the middle of the street, we're liable for, which I don't understand why that is. Thank you.
So, no, absolutely. So we have had a longstanding ordinance in the village that any private service lines are the responsibility of a resident. So in the water situation, your responsibility goes up to the B box, which is typically located either in the parkway or in the sidewalk. And so that's the situation you're talking about. Your sewer line doesn't have a shut off, right? We're never going to shut off your sewage. Like, it always needs to leave your house. So in some cases, depending on how the street was constructed, your sewer line, your private sewer line that serves your house either connects either in the parkway or in the middle of the street. It varies depending on the topography and other engineering conditions there. With that being said, the village board has heard that. We're working with staff to bring back a study to us to understand how we could maybe work to defray some of those costs or be more open to participating. So I think one area we could do is, I don't know if I can justify spending public money to fix your private sewer line, but why are you paying to repave our street? So that's a situation where we can reduce the costs and make that more equitable. But the problem is we don't budget for that today. And I hate to sound like I'm repeating myself over and over again, but this is the thing is, if we want to do things like that to give something back to our residents, or try to not make everything about, well, this broke and unfortunately you have to cover the full restoration costs, we don't have the funds to do that, because then that means we're cutting back on other projects. We're not able to continue to do things. We run a lean ship, and I think we should be very proud of that. But that means when push comes to shove, we don't do things when we need to, because we don't have the funds to do it. So that is something that the board is actively considering. We don't have a report today. Staff just was directed to do that after our prior board meeting. So that's something we're hoping to come back to, but a lot of that is dependent on how we start to figure out how we're going to address these solutions. So I hate to give you a non-answer, but it is something we are looking at, and that is an ordinance. So if that's something that, as community members, as you talk to neighbors, that would be a board decision that we would have to pass and change that. But that's been something that we've held up as a policy for quite some time now. With all due respect, we had another member of the audience who wanted to ask a question, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time. We'll have time afterwards to catch up, but the next section is going to be really important, talking about the finance piece. So, but yes.
So it's my understanding that there's no grants for the lead service replacements. And so homeowners are going to get part of that bill in their mailboxes. And we've got a little bit of running time. If you know who has lead service lines, are you contacting those people so they can start budgeting for that bill?
There's several things that are taking place. The village's website has a map that identifies all of the locations that are known or suspected. So if you go on the village's website and type in lead service lines, that map will pull up. We are working, well, the EPA just passed all these mandates throughout the year last year. So we are just working to identify some of the unsuspected locations. So there are several properties that we've already been in contact and in their homes to verify whether they are lead or copper. And then we're going to work to progress additional PR and stuff as we move forward. So the first project that we were working on, as I mentioned, is Maple Avenue. That one is taking place because of the fact that we have a water main replacement program. The rest of the lead service lines may not be associated with future projects. So we're working to develop a program and what that would look like moving forward, and how we would span that out over time as well.
I just have a brief question. When you said there was 3 of the studies that were being done?
For stormwater?
Yes.
Correct.
Could you please tell us where they're being done?
Sure, absolutely. So the first one is Meacham Creek, which is the north area of town, just south of 390. It basically is west of Roselle Road, all the way down to Plum Grove Road. So I can also look, it's referenced on the website. So that's the first area. The other one is near a Devlin wastewater treatment plant. So if you're familiar with where Trinity Church is, it's the area surrounding that and down through the Devlin wastewater treatment plant, which is located at Roselle and at Walnut and Rush Street. And the third one is the Seasons 4 park area. So there's areas surrounding that we've got some issues going through Seasons Park as well. You're welcome.
Your street. So we just had our pipes were clogged and you guys came out and helped us unclog them. And it was clogged at the swale, but we did not pay anything for that.
Are you talking about stormwater above ground?
No, it would be below ground, our pipes. So the swale, it was clogged because of a root.
Oh, so your sanitary service, yes.
Right. But we did not pay for anything, even though it was on right in front of our property in the swale. So are you saying that their pipes extend farther than our pipes do? Then that's why they have to pay for it?
So the responsibility of sanitary service lines, so you flush your toilet, you run your sink, that's a sanitary service. It's the property owner's responsibility from your home up to including the connection at the village's main. Many times people call and have backups. We actually will go out and check our main line because you don't know whether it's in our system or the private system. So it's possible when they came out and flushed or took a look at our main that it addressed the problem and it may have been on the private side. We have no ability to get up into the private service. We do sometimes have the ability to put a camera in if you have a clean out just to help you verify if it's on your end or our end, but we would have no way to clean that out. So I'm suspecting, without really knowing all the details, it potentially was at our main where the issue was.
So we're lucky that we don't have to pay, but it just seems very unfair that we don't have to, and then that whole street has to pay going all the way.
We would have offered the same situation if it happened on the next street. It has nothing to do with the location. It just depends on what the issue is exactly.
Where the pipes actually connect to the.
So basically from your home up to the point of where it connects, if it connects out in the street or if it connects across the street, it's all included.
Okay. Oh.
Hi, thank you for having this event tonight and for preparing this information. It's pretty sobering, some of the things you're saying and some of the things our residents are saying as well. I would just like to make a plug for doing some kind of inventory of the sidewalks so that you know where the points of pain are all over the town. I think the town needs to be more walkable. There needs to be a lot of attention paid on that. So that people can get outside and come downtown and not have to park, especially as we get more thriving businesses downtown. You've talked about sidewalks a little bit, but I think we need to really look at them. I would suggest hiring a bunch of college interns this summer and have them go out and inventory that so you really know what's going on with the different sidewalks. I'm particularly interested in the set, as you know, by Prospect. They're 50 years old plus, I'm guessing, and they're made out of asphalt, and there's no way that would ever hold up. that long and still be serviceable. They're just way depreciated, probably on the order of that man's street, I would guess. So I hope that, you'll really study that and factor that into future plans. I think we're going to have to pay more taxes here, which is terrible, but I can understand from looking at our property tax bill and knowing how old everything is and how deep everything is in the ground that, costs are going to go up, unfortunately.
And I think that's a great segue into our next thing. So one thing to answer your question, yes, we are looking at that particular area and we do maintain our sidewalks throughout town from a maintenance standpoint, but we have some areas that we're looking at from a connectivity standpoint and long-term replacement areas such as the one that you suggest. So I'm going to segue with that and talk about funding with Jason Blasky.
Well, I get to talk about infrastructure funding and kind of general sources of revenue that the village has for different types of projects and operations. And as Barbara Hockstead mentioned regarding property taxes, certainly a common question and statement we hear from residents is how much they pay for property taxes. If you've read past newsletters or other communication from the village, this dollar bill broken up is a common thing we've used over the years that shows how our roughly $6.3 million of property tax money is the total amount of property tax money that the village receives, is compared to your total property tax bill. So that 6 million village-wide is roughly 10% of your tax bill. So most of you may have a $6,000 to $8,000 tax bill. $700, $800, $600 to $800 is coming to the village, with the vast majority going to fund local education, as that dollar shows. Our other sources of revenue that fund our general fund from a property tax standpoint, really your taxes are used to fund general operations. So very little, if any, capital. So it pays for employees, it pays for police, it pays for fire. And that $6.3 million is less than a third of the total cost to operate our village on an annual basis. It costs about $21 million to operate our village, and your property tax is about $6.3 million. Our other sources of revenue that support the operations come from sales tax, income tax, ambulance billing, and other vehicle stickers and other taxes. So how does the village then fund its capital improvements? So there's really three sort of dedicated revenues. Utility tax, which are taxes paid on your electricity bill, your NICOR gas bill, and telephone bill. So those are kind of the primary sources of funding for the sidewalks, the stormwater, the buildings and grounds and loans. That's roughly $1.5 million. The CIS charge is on your water sewer bill. That is the one solely dedicated to funding water and sewer infrastructure projects. It doesn't cover operating for water and sewer, but it solely is dedicated to the projects. Currently, we collect $3.1 million annually through the CIS fee, and roughly 1.7 million of that has already been spent by past projects, to the tune that was shown in an earlier slide, that we've already invested $30 million over the last 8 or 9 years into capital improvements in water and sewer. And we did that through borrowing that money. So of the 3.1 million, 1.7 million is already dedicated to repaying those bonds, which results in about $1.5 million currently that we're able to use towards capital projects for water and sewer. Finally, it's the motor fuel tax. That is solely used for streets and bridges. And that revenue source is roughly $1 million a year. that we collect through that. That's a sales tax remitted back to local municipalities collected by the state of Illinois on a population basis. So those are really our kind of our primary ways that we fund our capital projects. So from a water sewer capital expenditure, you've heard the $80 million number related to what we anticipate having to spend by those mandated deadlines that Karen spoke about over the next 5 to 6 years. And how we get to that $80 million is broken down by treatment plants. So you see how much has to be spent at Devlin, Boderman, the general wastewater collection system, all of the pipes that take your sewer to the treatment plants, as well as some of the other kind of projects, the annual water main replacement project. So these are the projects that CIS is used to fund. That is currently that 1.7 million has already been dedicated. So it doesn't show a whole lot left currently to be able to fund these upcoming projects. Here's kind of more numbers for you. It's kind of a breakdown. The summaries are consistent with what was shown earlier, roughly getting to that $80 million expense. So this graph here shows kind of over our next 10 years, what our expenses look like from a capital projects perspective. So we kind of have it broken down into 5 years. So that dotted line on the left to the dotted line on the right is kind of the 5-year window that we're pretty much focusing on right now. And you can see that large increase in the red, which are the expenses, and the bottom being the green, the revenue. Kind of understanding the revenue necessary to cover the expenses that are ahead of us based on our water and sewer projects that are necessary. Again, much of this revenue source would be the CIS charge. This is a graphic we've been using a lot. Kind of same information, just being presented in a little different way as far as trying to close that gap. Where you see our existing funds coming in from the CIS charge, the green being what is necessary in order to repay loans over 20 years at that $4.5 million roughly, that is necessary to fund $80 million worth of projects. So that's really a big takeaway, hopefully, for this meeting today is how do we close that gap? So before I turn it back over to the mayor, just want to see, the summary, I think, is to reiterate how much of your property tax bill comes to the village of Roselle, how it uses those funds. What are the other revenues the village collects and how are those funds being used? And ultimately, from a water and sewer perspective, how that CIS charge is currently being used to go towards capital. So that's really for us, the main takeaways we want residents to have right now. And with that, any questions related to the financial side or information that was shared? So, oh, yes, sorry.
I'll ask that question for you. I know that the federal government, under the infrastructure bill that passed recently, does have a huge amount of money for lead service lines. I know EPA has got money as well. So the question I have is, though, in the pecking order of getting money from the feds of the state to the Roselle, we're low, we're medium, we're high. How much can you anticipate you think you can get over the next 2 to 3 years, perhaps, in lead service line alone?
Yeah.
Is that your question?
So I think her question was about pursuing loans for some of this, and
I'm grants.
Yep. And that's the two big thing, right? A loan you have to repay. So yes, we would have to do loans regardless because of the upfront cost for construction for these projects. 80 million has to be spent in, over 5 years. So grants, yes, we are pursuing grants. We've attempted various grants and early rounds we've been denied on every grant we've pursued. We did secure what I would consider a grant, a congressional project funding from Congressman Christian Murthy for stormwater. That window is open again to submit for that funding. And we have submitted 2 grant applications with 2 more coming in by the end of this week for additional funding. One of them is for $5.7 million for the Boderman wastewater treatment plant. Be making another one probably for 10 million for the Boderman wastewater treatment plant. We can ask for all we want. Whether or not Congress is going to give any money towards that funding is unclear. You know, for us in the grants that we've been trying to obtain, much of the analysis being done against that is kind of that equity equation of the overall demographic and financial position of the community. They're prioritizing those communities that you probably hear about on the news, whose water issues may be different than what we're facing. So that's at least so far how our grants have been evaluated. We've pursued grants through Cook County and have been told no. Through the state of Illinois have been told no. And I suspect, and I think we know, the demand for that in applications far exceeds the amount available. And the big numbers thrown out by the federal government are really spread over 5-10 years as well. When you hear 3 trillion, that's really 300, maybe billion over 10 years.
So I trust you and good luck.
Yeah. So we are trying and are extremely mindful of trying to do everything possible to minimize having to use your tax dollars. And if that's grants, that's talking to our legislators, it's lobbying our elected officials in Springfield and Washington to get as much as we can for this community.
The loan question, we're planning to borrow that 4.5 million we need. That's to pay the principal on those loans. So yep. So these would be IAL EPA grant loans that we'd be doing. And so, but we don't have the funds to pay those loans today. And that's the problem. That's why we need the 4.5 that was outlined earlier to close that gap. That's literally to pay for loans to finance this.
What are you looking at from a inflation rate standpoint for the next 5 to 10 years? What's the anticipation?
We'll turn it over to our local economist.
Actually, that's a very good question. I just had a seminar earlier this week that discussed the economic outlook for the next 10 years, and you know, in the inflation rate that's going on, they see that coming back to the norm of 3%, 2%. Right away, no, but they're starting to see that drop. They call it the non-headline inflation rate, the one that the economists look at, that's going to start coming back. It's not going to be right away, but the 10-year mark that you say, it's going to be more normal. Because when they look at 40 years, it's been, you know, 2.5% if you average that out. So we just got to get through this and make sure they don't go too high. You know, because 2.5 on what we're doing now is still a lot. So we are looking at that inflation rate though going forward.
On the grant applications, I just want to see if I understand it. We're not getting funded because they judge them on severity and ability to pay.
That is some criteria that they use, and they, as of the recent ones, they've been weighting the evaluation heavier towards that criteria.
And what are the other criteria?
Well, I think for any grant, it's really its need, just generally how we articulate the position we're in, the ability to pay for it, you know, what the types of projects we're pursuing. But we see on paper the communities that have received grants, when they say these are the communities that have received the first round of grants, and you know where those towns are, and in many cases they in the press releases highlight the fact that they got it due to their sort of socioeconomic status. So right now, that's really a prevailing condition, as many of these programs were approved because of that. You know, that's underlining criteria. Whether some of those get early on, they're the ones awarded, and maybe in the later years, they'll start to look at communities like ours. I would hope from our perspective, the arguments I make is these are state or federal mandated requirements. You're not funding it. The only way to fund it is to put it on the back of rate payers at an exorbitant amount of money. And hopefully that carries some weight in the evaluation process eventually, is to understand what it means to a consumer when they pass these mandates down and have, us implement them on the back of the rate payers.
Thank you.
So now we're at the solution sorry, we have one more question.
My name is Terry Erickson. I'm about to talk about the forbidden subject. And it relates to funding. I will be as very brief as I can, but I also want to be very clear. Many of you have probably seen at parking lots the thing that says handicap spot, $250 fine for parking here without a placard. The handicap spot affects a very few select people. Now, I'm not saying it shouldn't be or whatever. I'm just making a note that that only applies to what are considered to be handicapped people. $250 to block their spot. I wonder how many of our residents know that currently, even though I've been stating this for the 7 years since I've been back in Roselle, that this should be changed or updated because we now live in 2023 instead of 1930. $35 if you block a sidewalk for an extended length of time. $35. That affects all pedestrians, not just a select few people. So I have begged and pleaded for 7 years, including this current administration, let's adjust our ordinances, penalties to terms that are not back when Fred Flintstone existed. And it has fallen on deaf ears. In June of 2021, we had a meeting, which I thought was an awesome thing. Unfortunately, no useful solutions that were discussed and even promised. I haven't seen anything useful come out of that. One of the things is we will adjust the ordinances and increase the fines. The last 2 times I've been at public meetings and I have made comments, I have been told we're working on it. Terry doesn't realize these things take time. However, in the last several months, Mangy Dogs has been only trying to build their business for about a year. They've already had several ordinances rewritten for them. Metro 19 had a couple ordinances rewritten for them, several others for annexations. All sorts of other ordinances are being rewritten. And in fact, one of those ordinances that I saw had a little table in there about penalties for fees, and it actually listed that $35 for blocking the sidewalk is still in place. So we amended all the other parts of the ordinance, but we didn't do that simple thing of crossing out the 35 and adding a 0 or 2 after it. I don't know why we don't have time to amend those ordinances, because it would be very simple to do, in my estimation. I'm not a lawyer. I understand there's logistics and everything, but if you can adjust all sorts of other ordinances in the village, why can't we simply update the dollar amounts for penalties to make them into real world times, to make it actually worthwhile for a police officer or for a city official for their time to go out and write this ordinance? $35 ain't gonna cut it. But then the second part of this is it really doesn't matter what the ordinance says that they charge at current, because I've also been begging and pleading that they enforce these ordinances, which unfortunately is not being done at a useful speed to actually deter things. Now, I'm going to be honest with all of you. When I speak of these things, I'm more speaking of these things as public safety, not only for pedestrians, all residents of Roselle, in fact, all residents of the world, and also vehicles, because traffic laws affect all vehicles and all pedestrians and all residents, not just me. I walk down Maple Avenue here. I'm afraid to cross the crosswalks, even though there's signs there all over the place that says stop here for pedestrians. They don't even slow down when you're in the middle of the road. No enforcement. I've never seen any of those signs that say check your speed, even though I requested them many, many times. And I've heard from several police officers that are, I can't remember what his title is, but the traffic enforcement officer, he's busy doing other calls because the budget for the police department is so down. And these are other priority calls. So it doesn't do us too much good to raise the fines if we still have no interest in enforcing them. And I'm not going to be able to tell any of you how much money that would generate or not, but I can tell you that all I got to do is walk from the house to the village board meeting like I did tonight. And I could count probably 300 violations just in that short trip. There's revenue. Unfortunately, all of my attempts, all of the promises made, nothing useful has happened. There's revenue out there for you folks, and that doesn't increase your property taxes. That's a revenue towards those who are breaking the law and making life unsafe for our residents. I wish somebody else would join me in the fight to make that more of a priority. And just as a side note for Brian Jonas, who promised me last year that Dick Wickstrom Chevrolet would no longer plow snow onto the sidewalk. And I don't think he charged them that whopping $35 before because they're quote a good partner for us. We haven't had much accumulating snow this year, but even in the two that we had, both times, Dick Wickstrom Chevrolet plowed some snow onto the sidewalk. So the education part that the city's always been telling me about, we're going to do education first, which I haven't. I've many, many times offered my services for that, and it's fallen on deaf ears, and no one even wants to take a walk with me to identify the problems. I don't understand any of that, but funding could largely be taken, be increased for the city by simply raising our ordinance fees for penalties and then enforcing them. Thank you.
When it comes to our ordinance fees, we do review them on a cadence. What I will say is police activity is not meant to be a revenue driver. It's for public safety. I'm never going to ask our department to put ourselves in a position where they're issuing tickets for the sake of making revenue. We issue tickets to maintain and encourage public safety at the end of the day. And while I appreciate the sentiment and, are there things we might need to evaluate to see if they can be a more appropriate penalty? I don't think that's going to be the way that we're going to address these larger structural issues at the end of the day. Speaking of the plans though, property taxes were mentioned, and property taxes do not fund capital today. And we are not going to raise property taxes to fund capital tomorrow. So I want to level set that right now. That's not on the table. That's not what this board is interested in. That's what we want to talk about. We want to use other tools because the village has been very conservative about how it raises revenue. There's a lot of untapped potential out there today. So we don't have to add another, burden on top of an already kind of large tax bill today. So we already kind of highlighted at the beginning that our strategic plan is really focused on addressing the root cause of this issue. And so seeking opportunities, whether it's financial stewardship through there or through focused redevelopment to really make sure that we can generate revenue in smart ways. We talked about IEPA loans. And so that's a fundamental thing that we're going to have to, we have to borrow. We're not unrealistic. We're not going to try to raise $80 million over the next 5 years. I can't afford it. You can't afford it. None of us want to do that. So one thing that we want to do is there are policies out there where we can actually get some of those loans forgiven. So that's a great way. It's not a grant, but there's a way where, like anything else, you pay most of the balance and then the government's willing to write off and say, you know what, you did what we wanted you to do, and they're willing to help us to write some of that debt off on their end, and then we don't have to pay that. That's a great strategy that as we borrow, it's not a guarantee, but it's a way that we can hopefully help reduce that overall burden down the road. We're also talking about advocacy efforts to hopefully try to find other ways we can grow our revenue passively. So there's something called the Local Government Distributive Fund, or LGDF. A lot of other states, you actually pay an income tax, not only to the state, you pay an income tax to the municipality. Sometimes you pay an income tax to a taxing body like a school district. In Illinois, I think we had the right idea. We have one income tax, but a part of that was a fundamental agreement that the state would give the municipalities their share of that, so we didn't have an income tax on top of people. Over time, and obviously we saw issues in the recession, those guarantees were reduced dramatically by the state legislature and have not been returned to those historic levels. So the Village of Roselle, as well as our COG, the DuPage County Managers and Mayors Association, we're continuing to lobby and hopefully try to see that increase to 10%. That's not going to solve all of our problems, but that's more funding that you're already paying, but it's not going to your community, it's going to the state. So we want to see things continue to come back. And as was mentioned earlier, we've been really aggressive with grants, and I think more aggressive than we've ever been before. Unfortunately, not as successful, but we've had wins. We were able to secure $750,000 from Raja to hopefully help do some of these stormwater management studies to help us start some projects on that. And we also received grant funding for the Ruttenberg Road reconstruction that will be starting to happen. So we have been strategic in trying to find these. Problem is different criteria, different scoring. We don't always win. The thing is, we're going to continue to try, but grants are not guaranteed. And so just as much as we may apply for 10, we may get 0. Next year, we might get 2. We just don't know. And so it's built into our strategy, but we can't use that to guarantee how we're going to solve these issues. So to kind of go through some of our current tools, I'll have Village Administrator Belowski come up and discuss those.
Thank you. I highlighted earlier kind of how the CIS charge currently works and how it is used to apply towards water and sewer capital. On average, the homeowner currently pays about $309 per year in the CIS charge. In order to meet the need to make those additional capital improvement charges, or to make those capital improvements within our system, this CIS charge may very well have to triple. And that's when I was kind of talking about before, solely putting the cost of all this on ratepayers. That would be the village's really only option right now, based on kind of the tools that we have in our toolbox. And I believe that's the option the board would like to least likely use. So that's kind of why we'll start to talk about some of what those other tools exist out there that potentially could be given to the village to minimize that. The utility rate there that you pay on your ComEd bill, the village has not maxed out that. So there is an incremental increase that through a local ordinance, the board could approve to get that up to the maximum, which would be about another $90,000 that could go into that capital improvements fund to put towards future projects. Here's a graphic that compares our water sewer rate, which is in the middle of that graph, against area communities, size population 40,000 and under. So here it's just that we often hear from residents that they know people in other communities and what their rates may be. So we wanted to kind of at least show a comparable. I think it's important that no two cities are the same, and there's extreme nuance in municipal finance and the history of how a community got to where they got to. But I think the big takeaway for us, at least, is kind of where we are middle of the pack currently. Certainly based on our needs to make improvements, I would expect maybe that we would start to march to the left, but also then the number of treatment plants. When you have 2, that means multiple plants you're maintaining. I think often relates to how much your rates are, because we're maintaining more. We may have a smaller base to put that across as well. But just wanted to show kind of how many treatment plants are in some of the neighboring communities as it relates to Roselle, and then what our rate is compared to some other comparable communities. So from future tool perspective, so as a non-home rule municipality, which Roselle is, under state law, we can only do what the state allows us to do or tells us to do. So you can't be as creative. If you're home rule, you can do anything that the state tells you you can't do. So you can kind of be more flexible if you're a home rule municipality. As a non-home rule, it limits our ability to kind of impose different revenue. To me, non-home rule has less tools in their toolbox, is the analogy I always go back to, versus home rule can be more flexible and be more creative to address local issues locally. So looking at, again, kind of that delta that we've been highlighting over many of these slides and seeing what our current revenue is and what it brings in compared to where we need to get to. One of the options is a non-home rule sales tax that's imposed at point of sale on pretty much all goods that you currently pay sales tax on. There are some exclusions from that, but which are defined by state law. But that would require approval by a local referendum. So that would have to be on a ballot, and the majority of people voting would have to approve that. Imposing it at the state maximum 1%, which is basically a doubling, because the village currently only receives 1% of sales tax, would pretty much close that gap on what was needed for water and sewer capital. And under state law, a non-home rule sales tax can only be used on basically capital. It kind of, by definition, it's limited on its use. It can't be used for operating. So you can't use it to hire employees. So that's kind of one option that is kind of on the table, if you will, and that to help close that gap that is not user fee based. From a home rule perspective, the options are more numerous. It gives you more tools to be creative. There are some, so from a home rule standpoint, there's about 1,300 cities in our state, and about 220 of those are home rule. So the vast majority of municipalities are non-home rule. The vast majority of home rule municipalities are the Chicagoland area. By default, it's any town that's 25,000 or greater in population. Otherwise, as this graphic shows, the 66% of all home rule municipalities received it through referendum. So much like a non-home rule sales tax, to become home rule, it would require the majority of those voting on that to approve it. That would give the village additional authority under state law to basically, you could impose then through an ordinance instead of through a referendum if you were home rule, a home rule sales tax. It also is looked more favorably by kind of bond underwriting. So if you're out to get loans, you likely would be able to borrow at a lower interest rate because you're considered home rule. You're considered to have more means to ensure that you don't default on those loans. So it's looked positively kind of by underwriting and rating agencies. And then it also allows, you know, the more tools you have in the toolbox, it gives more kind of flexibility to look at existing revenue that the village has and maybe kind of reallocating that to different funds to help bridge some of the gaps on the capital projects perspective. So here's under a home rule scenario, looking at our current revenue, looking at the comparison of having a non-home rule sales tax. And then if you were to become home rule, kind of that extra bit at the top reflects a motor fuel tax being imposed. So under state law, a non-home rule cannot impose a motor fuel tax even through referendum. That can only be accomplished if you're a home rule municipality. So kind of the comparison of the current state, the non-home rule state, and the home rule state, and identifying what more revenue the village could potentially obtain in those different scenarios. I will turn it back to the mayor.
Thank you, Jason. And so I think when we start to talk about home rule, I know it's scary and it's something that a lot of people have emotional reaction to, and there's a lot of information out there on the topic and whatnot. But the way I think about it is it's local control. Instead of the state dictating what we can and can't do, you're having the people that are your neighbors that you elect able to have more autonomy and ability to make decisions for the community that's right. So what's not also captured is the ability to generate new revenue opportunities that aren't through property taxes or other means like that. But we also then have more autonomy to then make some decisions to reallocate revenue lines and wanted to cover some of these infrastructure projects. So some of that soft that you don't see. The thing that's probably surprising is we're surrounded by home rule communities, and you probably don't realize this, but every community around us except for Itasca has home rule authority. And so you can see right now across the board, additional sales tax. Every single person, even Itasca has a non-home rule sales tax, has an additional sales tax. Roselle does not. So if you eat, shop, do anything in one of these towns, can you raise your hand for me? And I know it's pedantic, but please, you're paying for their roads, you're paying for their infrastructure, you're helping those communities out. Motor fuel tax. So most of the communities have one. Addison does not, Elk Grove does not, and Itasca does not because they don't have home rule authority, but a lot of these communities have an additional motor fuel tax. And again, I know I'm guilty of filling up at Costco because I love their cheap gas. I'm paying for Bloomingdale's roads. And then eating establishment tax is something that we all have the option to or the opportunity to do. And most places have that as well at a higher rate than we have. Ours is at 1.25. And so I think the purpose here is to just show that we always think, or we might think like, wow, I'm tired of being charged so much in Roselle. The fact is we've been so conservative, so responsible with our money. We're leaving money on the table to the point where we're at today, where we have funding gaps that we need to resolve here. And so we have a lot of different creative opportunities here that would not involve property taxes, that would not need to go to the CISV, because I understand it is a big expense for households. But there's things that we can do to help our community have the infrastructure and the building that it has. So we're going to open it up for our last kind of question and answer segment, but I just want to kind of cover again, really we have three different options here. So today, the board has the authority, if we've got these funding gaps that we've already identified, we can use user fees and utility tax increases to cover this. That's probably the least desirable outcome that we want to have, but that's something that we can do today with the authority we have. Another option is we could go forward and have a referendum next year and implement a non-home rule sales tax. That would be set until the voters decide to change that. And that would help us cover the gap, at least for a water treatment plant. Now, the road condition, those things that we talked about earlier that we are seeing degrade over time, sidewalks, all those other things, that wouldn't help us with that today. Once we pay off the loans, we would have that additional revenue we could use for those projects, but that just solves our gap today for our water treatment plants that need to be updated. Or we could do home rule status, which gives the village board the autonomy to then make decisions, deliberate, have the conversation with the community, and go ahead and implement a variety of different solutions. So that way, whether you're a resident or not, a visitor, maybe someone doing business in our town or just a visitor, they're also able to generate revenue for us to help us update and maintain our infrastructure here. Both of those would require a referendum. The only thing that the board could do today is increase user fees, which we've done for years, and a utility tax increase, which we have not done. Oh, sorry. So with that being the case, I know that was a lot of information and it could be dense at times. Are there any questions on kind of the funding opportunities or some of the options? And again, I want to stress, we're sharing this with the community because we want your input. The board has not made a decision to move forward on any of this. We're looking for feedback and we want to share where we're at so that way we can make the right decision for our community. So any questions on some of the specifics? We'll get you a microphone. Right over here. 1 second, please.
You have an estimated time frame when you'll make the decision, what you'll do, you'll suggest?
I think we have to make a decision at some point this fall. The first opportunity we would have to go to referendum would be in, I believe, March of next spring. So depending on the feedback we get from tonight and the additional information we gather, we'll probably have a series of other community conversations. But our hope would be to try to come up with a solution that the community can kind of chew on for next spring. What I would say is very likely, there's a scenario where we could put both of those on the ballot, and that way you can choose which option or neither option, right? And I think that's something that very well could be the case because the board can't make the last two options themselves. So there's no risk in putting that to the community to vote on either option. We got a question right up here.
I just want to say, it doesn't sound like you have any choice with this. You have a lot of money that you have to get loans for, and we have a lot of work to do. So it sounds like we just need to do it, right?
I mean, it's not, sorry,
Right?
we don't have a lot of options here. I think the reality is if we don't do this stuff, we could have our permits pulled, and which means we might not be able to treat wastewater, which could create a whole lot of other issues for the community. Property values could go down. I don't need to paint that picture. I think the fact of the matter is we have a choice in how we get there. And I think that's what I'm focused on is you're absolutely right. We need to find this money one way or another. Loans, we can float for only so long before we find those revenue opportunities. We can only try to recruit and try to find as many redevelopment opportunities as we can. So there's other things that we're always going to do. Those are just not guaranteed. But I would say we have at least 3 solid options here to help us close the gap. And that's where I think that's where our conversation is today. Which of these, probably none of these are palatable or really ideal, but what's the least bad one that we think we can move forward on?
Well, the least bad would be the non-home rules sales tax because you're not affecting us as residents, correct?
Unless, I mean, when you go to Little Red Ribbon and you shop there, or if you're making a transaction in the village, you would still pay that tax. But your friend also does too.
Yeah, I didn't even know I was doing that at other towns. Like, how would I wouldn't even know that. I've
No.
been going to Schaumburg my whole life and paying for everything.
And that's
that
why
do.
they like to say how low their taxes are because we're all paying their taxes.
Right. All right. And then, of course, the worst would be the user fees, because then we would see that would be hard on people with fixed incomes. and that would be
Absolutely.
Absolutely not what we want to do. And then home rule status, aren't we really close to 25,000? Wouldn't we go into home rule status once we got 1,500?
So it's not guaranteed. And I think that's where I see that as it gives us the ability to be more flexible. So when we do non-home rule sales tax, for instance, whatever that rate is that we set as a community, that's it. And maybe that's too high, maybe that's too low. We can't do anything until we go back to the voters to ask them. Home rule gives us, the board, the ability and the authority to set and change those. So I see that as really, okay, today, based on our projections, 1% is what we need. We might find 2 years in, actually, we've attracted a big box retailer. We've done other things to grow it. We don't need that 1%. Maybe we want to lower that to 0.75. The board then has that ability to increase it or decrease it based on the information they're receiving versus non-home rule. It's set at the ballot box and it's locked that way until we go back to the ballot box. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay. Why don't we get Terry first, because we haven't heard from him yet, and then we can do. Well, you're our number one VIP, so how could I not know you?
I got a couple of questions. For many years, I'd read letters and it would always say we'd pat ourselves on the back for having a surplus. Where's that surplus?
So one thing that the board did that I'm really proud of is we made a decision that you're right, we've had a surplus and I think we've been budgeting conservatively, but not necessarily able to address these growing issues. One of the decisions this board made was that, you know what, we are going to set a cap on our surplus. And so anything that goes above that threshold, we have to invest in either pension payments or infrastructure. So we are, as we exceed, there's some reserves you need. It's like your rainy day account, right? If something unexpected happens, you lose your job or you have an unexpected medical bill, you need to have savings to pay for those unexpected costs. So we always want to have some money in the bank for those purposes. But to your point, we've determined, and I believe the amount's over 50%. So if we can't cover, if we have over 50% in reserve, we're now dedicating that money, or 45, I'm close, thank you. But Tom's holding me accountable. 45%. So anything above 45% in surplus is going straight to infrastructure or our pension payments for the community.
And then when you were talking about home rule status down the road, you would have the authority or the board would have the authority to lower or raise the taxes. Slim chance that you guys would say, hey, you know what? Too much taxes, we'll drop it.
I think that's the beautiful thing though, is like, to your point, absolutely be skeptical. First of all, I think from my perspective, communities can self-limit their home rule authorities. They can pass an ordinance that says we as a community, even though we have this authority, will not allow ourselves to do X, Y, and Z. But the thing is, you elect your board. So to your point, I think this is an accountability piece. When I say it's local control, it's local control. So if you don't like what the board's doing, they're increasing things, vote them out. And I know it's an election season. Some people are probably feeling a little bit uncomfortable with me saying that, but you have every right to be able to hold us accountable and say, get out of Village Hall. I'm not going to tolerate those types of increases. So there is some more accountability, I think, because we're your neighbors and you can have some pretty immediate reactions to that versus sometimes some of these other policies. It's multiple people that you don't have control over or elect dictating those.
So I have a little ignorance here. We have the village of Roselle, we have the township of Bloomingdale, we have the county of DuPage. What overlap does the township and the county have in helping us out?
Specifically with wastewater treatment and that, none. So we all have independent responsibilities. Some communities on that prior kind of comparison slide, they have, they're either part of a wastewater treatment kind of consortium. So Cook County has a massive system and whatnot. I could tell you from my personal perspective, 40 years down the line, that's the future of this. We treat water the same across the board. There's no Roselle way to do it, Bloomingdale way to do it, Naperville way to do it, even though Naperville probably pretends there is. But with that aside, it's expensive to do that, to consolidate. If you think about a lot of these are gravity fed or how and where the water flows, it's really complicated. That's why we've got great people to do that stuff for us every day in Public Works. And we're featured in our Roselle Minute earlier promoting this event. But that's probably the future. But that's going to take a federal subsidy to make that happen because that's going to be billions of dollars of infrastructure upgrades to consolidate these systems together. And frankly, with the deadlines we have, we have to make this investment in our system today. The other thing I think is important is when we're talking about a lot of the EPA requirement updates, we also have a capacity issue, which means we have to look at every project for certain basins and consider, do we even have the capacity to have a new development go in? And this is something that could be very limiting for us in the future here because we want to see our town grow in a smart way and have new revenue opportunities. But if we literally don't have the capacity to treat that additional sewage, we might have to say no in the future. And that's a concerning thing where we try to balance things, not through fees. To grow, we're reaching an inflection point.
So besides the fiscal flexibility associated with home rule, are there any other advantages?
So I think broadly, yes. So I think Jason's point earlier, kind of what we have some more ability to make additional regulations and requirements. So I think one good example that came up was when we were considering the Airbnb situation. One big power that we would have is we could require licensing or registration with the village as an authority that we can't do today. And so that would allow us then to be able to have a better idea about, especially like with multifamily housing, we could have better accountability with like crime-free housing laws that would restrict and do background checks and require that for those kind of housing subdivisions and give us more ability to make sure that we can keep our community the way that we would like to see it from that side of things. There's a lot of, it's hard to answer that question because that's one example, but we have a lot of ability to put in place regulations that we would feel could help us maintain better control over things that we don't have today.
So if we went for the home rule status, is there anything that the village can do for the residents to give back to us? Like, could we say, could you reduce the cost of our parking stickers? Could you get rid of that? Because there's a lot of villages that don't have to pay for their vehicle stickers. So if we went with that and you say, okay, we want you guys to vote for this because it's going to help us with the capital improvements, is there some way that you guys can give something back to us to say, yeah, but we're going to get rid of the vehicle stickers?
So if that is something based on the feedback we get from this session and other sessions, that's something we would start to do. I think part of it is we're not going to invest time and effort in something. If everyone's like absolutely no home rule, then that's fine. We're not going to put our energy behind it. To your point though, if we go back to that other slide, how many of those communities have a vehicle sticker? I don't think too many of them do. So I guess my point is we would be evaluating and trying to figure out what are better ways to capture that revenue, and we could make some trade-offs, whether it's reducing or eliminating certain fees or phasing them out over time. Like there's more flexibility that we have that like it'd be easier to not administer a program to collect fees and just have it built onto your tab at a place. Those are things that we would strongly consider, I would say.
So Dave, I've been interested in the number one column, user fees, which is kind of the third rail I imagine to you guys. But what would happen to project out if you just didn't raise it 3 times, raise it double, or raise it, incrementally, raise user fees upon us?
So
see what has a revenue stream there and home rule perhaps as well. So there's some kind of us to figure out what's going on. Because believe me, folks, this conversation is taking place across the whole country. This is not just Roselle. Everybody's got to face the same thing. These are, the rules might sound onerous, but they're for public health and public well-being. So they're there for a reason. I appreciate that. So, but we all got to deal with it in some way, shape, or form. We got to pay our own way. Plus, we got to find other ways of getting money. So that's my question. How can you mix and match some of the revenue sources?
Yeah, so I think one thing that we do is, first of all, we buy our water from Chicago. So that's probably a fact that I don't know if a lot of people understand. So they control a lot of the water rates. I'm going to be honest with you. So we do evaluate those things, but when they give us a cost increase, someone's got to pay for the water, right? So I think rate increases aren't going to go away because we do a non-home rule sales tax or a home rule status. Even if we didn't do those and we had to rely on user fees, we would absolutely graduate it in. There's no sense in saying, okay, tomorrow it's double, the next day it's 3 times. That would not be the case. It would be metered in over time and whatnot. But we're talking about going away from a steep cliff that we would have to climb up versus just having those gradual costs and inflation of being absorbed through those fees. And I think what we would see is, we've been increasing these fees steadily with some exceptions during the pandemic where we did a temporary fee freeze. We're always going to see those inch up. But I think what we are trying to avoid is what we saw back in 2016, I want to say, when we had our first 5-year rate. I was close. Okay. But we had rates pretty low for a while there. We had to have some bigger chunks of increases. We're trying to get away from that situation again that we saw earlier on where there's a lot of feedback and concerns from the community, and keeping it to just those gradual increases that we see versus like a big one-time infrastructure improvement like we're seeing today. So hopefully that answers your question. Other questions on the tools? Yeah, absolutely. Let's get the mic over there.
So based on the meeting tonight, all the people in this room are going to be the most educated, probably, or among the most educated, other than the board, that is, on this issue. What messages do you want us to carry to our neighbors that aren't here tonight?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, all this information is going to be publicly available. So a lot of our summaries will be, I think, a great takeaway that you can bring to your neighbors or your friends and talk about. This meeting is being streamed and recorded. So I know it's an hour and a half long, but that's a great thing for people who want to digest it, and you can stop and play it, watch each section, think about it and come back to it. So I think this is a conversation we're gonna have to have. And I think the other thing is we want to make sure that we're engaging people. So invite them to the next one. We are going to have another session, whether it's this exact content or maybe we elaborate more on some of the specifics here, but we're going to be having this conversation throughout this year to make sure that everyone understands and they're comfortable. So that way people are educated on the decisions that they have in front of them. But I think the big thing is while we've been living within our means, that comes at a cost, and we have mandated requirements upon this village, and we have forecasted future, reduction in the quality of our infrastructure that we need to have a dramatic change in the way that we discuss funding. And the 3 best ways we can do that is either through user fees, through a non-home rule sales tax, or by granting the village home rule authority, which would then allow it to do other revenue sources. So in a nutshell, that would be my takeaway.
Can you also comment on which one is the most regressive tax?
User fees are the most regressive. I mean, they're all to some degree regressive because of the fact that it's built onto something based on your income level, whether you're buying a $5, meal at McDonald's or you're having a steak dinner at 1913. Some of that stuff is going to be a little bit regressive, but I would say the user fees are probably the worst because especially those that are flat fees or they're based on a rate in the case of water. But those can be more disproportionately impacted versus a percent of your bill. So I know we're hitting the hour and a half mark. So want to thank everyone for coming out here tonight. As you leave, if you could, please fill out that bottom survey for us if possible. If you're really wanting to mull it over, you can drop it off in the lobby when you feel free to when we're open, or we'll be releasing an online digital survey. I think hopefully I know it's very sobering, but you're coming with eyes wide open, understanding more about the finances of the village, but also all the things that are going into consideration for us going forward. And I really appreciate you being engaged in the process. I think the one thing that's great about Roselle is I know we had a lot of great input and feedback, and I know there's a lot of situations out there, and I don't think anyone's going to say we are doing everything perfectly today, but we want to make sure that this is the best village for everyone moving forward, and how can we tackle these issues in a way that's equitable and fair. And so I think being a part of the conversation is a really important part, and together we're going to be able to find the right solution for the village going forward. So I'd like to thank our staff, our board for being here tonight, and we'll be all here. So if you want to engage us with additional questions or conversation, we'd be happy to talk to you. So thank you so much, everyone.